The endless machinery of the Imperium never truly rests. Forge worlds burn with fire and smoke, their skies blackened by exhaust, their oceans reduced to vats of coolant, their mountains hollowed into manufactoria that stretch for kilometers. These planets are not homes, but engines, beating hearts that keep the Imperium's war machine alive. Yet even the greatest engines can falter. Imagine, for a moment, a forge world falling silent. No Vox traffic, no data streams, no convoys of Scutarii marching in perfect unison. Only void, and the gnawing fear of what silence means in the 41st millennium. For when a forge world ceases to speak, when its endless hymns to the Omnissiah fall mute, the galaxy holds its breath. Was it plague, invasion, heresy, or something far worse? In a galaxy ruled by war and shadow, silence is never peace. It is omen. It is warning. It is the sound of death already come. The forge world of Drelgast had always thundered. Its continents were mountains of smelters and crucibles. Its rivers ran with runoff slag and sacred oils, and its skies pulsed in unending rhythm with the pounding of hammers, the shriek of gears, and the ceaseless drone of industry. To live here was to forget silence, for silence was a sin against the Omnissiah. Each dawn was marked by the rattling surge of production quotas, each night consumed by the grinding of assembly lines that never slept. The air tasted of promethium, and the people breathed it like incense, their lungs scarred but sanctified. It was a world that existed not for itself, but for the Imperium entire, a heart that beat iron blood into the veins of 1,000,000 battlefronts. And then, without warning, the heart skipped. It was subtle at first. A worker deep in a manufactorum line heard his conveyor falter. The shrill scream of an auspex array cut off mid-cycle. In the data vaults, adepts traced flickering symbols across their rune-etched screens, their servoskulls hesitating in their orbit as if unsure of their next movement. The interruptions were no more than a breath between pulses, a hesitation easily explained as a fluctuation of power, a common glitch, a machine spirit pausing in contemplation. Yet such a thing, though small, planted unease. For in the Imperium of man, nothing fails without cause. The unease spread as hours passed. Vox links that had once roared with static-laced commands began to quiet. Entire frequencies dropped away into dead air. Administratum scribes reported shipments delayed, then vanished. At first they marked the discrepancies in red ink, their quills scratching dutifully as they prepared reprimands and penalties. But reprimands require recipients, and no answers came. One manufactorum after another fell silent, until the silence itself felt louder than any machine's roar. Tech priests gathered in ritual chambers, their robes heavy with sacred oils, their mechadendrites writhing like a forest of iron serpents. They intoned litanies to calm the machine spirits. They bathed cogitator banks in incense smoke. They struck metal with consecrated wrenches to stir slumbering gears into life. Some systems answered. Many did not. The priests spoke in binary cants filled with static-laden desperation, but the Omnissiah remained mute. For every circuit that reawakened, 10 more guttered into dark. Workers stumbled through quiet manufactoria where conveyor belts no longer carried shells, where vats of molten steel cooled into useless husks. They felt the silence as a physical weight pressing on their chests, for the song of industry had been the heartbeat of their lives. Now, without it, time stretched unnaturally. Every footstep echoed. Every whisper was too loud. Children born to the rhythm of machinery pressed their palms to cold walls and asked their parents when the forges would sing again. No answer satisfied. At the orbital docks, captains prepared for routine shipments of weapons and munitions bound for the front. But the cargo elevators remained still. Vast loading cranes hung motionless above skeletal hulls. Pilots waited on Vox order, yet the command never came. Some lingered in orbit, their ships circling like carrion birds over a corpse. Others broke faith and left, their holds empty, their thoughts troubled with unspoken fear. It was the silence on the Vox that disturbed most. Not the static of interference, not the shriek of jamming signals, but the clean, absolute absence of response. When a hailing frequency falls into static, at least there is noise to rage against. But here there was nothing, just void, as if the voices of an entire world had been swallowed. The silence began to gnaw. Administrators whispered of mass breakdowns. Scutarii cohorts reported missing patrols in sectors where lights no longer burned. Some whispered darker thoughts, that a great power had moved unseen, and the stillness was only its shadow. For in the grim darkness of the far future, absence is never neutral. It is always an omen, always the prelude to ruin. And yet, the most unnerving truth was this: the stars themselves gave no answer. No distress beacon pierced the void. No astropathic cry reached Terra. The Forge world did not call for help. It simply stopped. The silence endured, and as the hours stretched into days, the surface of Drelgast began to warp beneath its weight. In the endless cities of steel and fire, people still moved, but their steps no longer fell in time with the pulse of machines. A servitor without command protocols is a hollow shell, its gaze empty, its limbs twitching without purpose. Rows of them stood idle in manufactoria bays, their augmetics hissing faintly, awaiting orders that would never arrive. Their stillness mirrored the unease of their flesh and blood counterparts. Men and women accustomed to labor without pause now wandered corridors of rusted metal with nothing to carry, nothing to weld, nothing to assemble. The first riots began in the underhabs, not riots of rebellion, but of desperation. Entire families, long bound to assembly lines that no longer moved, found themselves without ration credits. For credits are earned only in labor, and labor was denied. They screamed prayers to the Omnissiah and begged for the priests to restore the forges. Some lit pyres of scrap metal, believing fire might awaken the slumbering machine spirits. Others fell to their knees before silent cogitators, hammering the keyboards with bloody fists, as though pain alone could call forth command prompts from blank screens. The air of the habs grew heavy with incense smoke, mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies and promethium soot, until even the faithful began to doubt. The tech priests themselves fared little better. In the sanctums of the Red Basilica, a conclave gathered, their voices weaving binary prayers into the air like strands of thread unraveling. The Muggos of Drelgast, an immense figure of cables and plated brass, demanded explanations. His voice boomed through a vox grill, distorted into a mechanical growl that echoed across the chamber walls. Reports were offered, entire foundries unresponsive, reactor cores slowing, energy distribution hubs fluctuating wildly. None could offer clarity. The Muggos extended a mechadendrite toward a hololithic display, its flickering image showing zones of the planet darkening one by one. To those assembled, it looked less like a technical failure and more like a spreading infection. Scutari patrols combed the rusted avenues, their augmetic eyes piercing the gloom, their galvanic rifles gleaming with polished steel. At first they sought saboteurs, imagining rebels or heretics lurking in the ducts. But the ducts held only rats and dust. Then they hunted for signs of Xeno's infiltration, probing tunnels, securing foundries, scanning air vents for traces of spores or toxins. Yet nothing came. No tracks, no corpses, no broken hulls or breached walls. Their search turned inward. But what enemy could they fight when the adversary was absence itself? Still, some swore they heard things in the stillness. Servitors left untethered began to twitch at once, as though a single signal ran through their dormant systems. Laborers claimed they heard whispers in the cooling pipes, a faint binary cant repeating words they could not understand. One overseer, his robes drenched in the oil of extinguished furnaces, raved that the machine spirits were angry, that the forge had grown tired of man's endless demands. He was silenced swiftly, his words deemed heresy, but the thought lingered. If the machine could rebel, what chance had the flesh? The void ships circling above grew restless. Captains called for clearance to land, to seize the stores they had been promised, but no voice answered from planetary control. Some attempted descent regardless, only to find docking beacons extinguished and defense systems unresponsive. A few pressed further, sending shuttles down to surface pads, but none returned. With every failure, more vessels broke orbit, choosing survival over mystery, until only the most desperate remained, watching the darkened world below with mounting dread. Even beyond Drelgast, ripples began to spread. Other worlds noted the missing shipments. Segmentum Command grew uneasy at the absence of astropathic contact. Rumors multiplied like spores in shadowed corners. Some whispered of a Necron tomb stirring beneath the forge's crust, its awakening bleeding energy from the planet's veins. Others spoke of demons lurking in the warp, their talons dragging whole Vox frequencies into silence. And among the darkest whispers were those that dared to accuse the Forge world itself, suggesting its magi had chosen heresy, had cut their ties to the Imperium to worship some forbidden engine god whose hunger required stillness before the feast. On the ground, though, truth was simpler and crueler. Men and women of the hives could not eat faith alone. Without shipments of ration bricks, hunger began to creep. Without power to circulate the cooling systems, hablocks overheated, their air thick with sweat and smoke. Without the song of the forges, the world felt wrong, its silence growing louder each passing day. And so desperation deepened into madness. A mother clutched her child and swore she heard gears grinding beneath the floor, though the factory had been cold for weeks. A scribe gouged words into a data slate with his nails until they broke, claiming the machine demanded blood, not ink. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence, heavy, suffocating, unbearable. And in the deepest manufactoria vaults, where the air grew thin and the walls sweated condensation, a single light flickered to life across a dormant cogitator. Its green glow pulsed like a heartbeat in the dark. The adepts who found it swore they heard it whisper binary hymns, though none dared translate the words aloud. The knights of Drelgast were no longer drowned beneath the hammering of manufactoria. Where once the glow of furnace light painted the heavens in shifting crimson, now the skies were black, studded with only the distant fire of orbital vessels. The stars themselves seemed colder, sharper, as if watching. In the habstacks, families huddled close, whispering litanies to the Omnissiah not for strength, but for sound, terrified of the stillness that pressed through every wall. Children asked when the machines would wake again. Parents lied with hollow voices, for even they no longer believed. In the temples of the Mechanicus, the priests performed rites of awakening, pouring libations of sacred oils across cogitators, burning incenses of recycled polymers, chanting strings of binary cant until their vocal units glitched from overuse. Yet the machine spirits did not answer. Screens remained dark, engines remained inert. Even the reactors, the titanic cores that had burned since before the Great Crusade, now groaned in their housings like beasts gasping for breath. The priests clung to their litanies, but doubt spread among them like rust. Some whispered that the Omnissiah himself had turned his face away. Others accused their peers of impurity, their bionics glinting with suspicion. Meanwhile, the Skitarii patrols that still stalked the surface began to vanish. First a squad in the southern manufactoria, their Vox beacons abruptly silenced mid-transmission. Then an entire cohort dispatched to the rail yard hives, their identifiers blinking off the command slate one by one. At first, overseers assumed jamming or signal corruption, but when a search party arrived at the rail yard, they found only abandoned rifles, their galvanic coils still humming faintly, dropped as though their wielders had simply ceased to exist. Panic crept higher. Rumors no longer whispered in hidden corners. They spilled into the streets, into the shrieks of the hungry, into the desperate fists of workers hammering at locked temple gates. The silence had become an enemy. It was no longer absence. It was presence, oppressive and vast, a force pressing down on every soul. The forges were dead, the skies were mute, and now even the soldiers bred to obedience were falling away. The world itself felt as though it were unraveling. In orbit, the last of the waiting ships broke. Several captains chose flight, abandoning their contracts, leaving Drelgast to its fate. But one vessel lingered, the cruiser Veritas Lux, commanded by a pious captain whose oath to the throne forbade retreat. He ordered a final attempt at contact, sending a shuttle packed with Vox amplifiers and astropathic relays to the surface. The shuttle descended through air thick with smoke and industrial haze, its hull streaked with ash. For a time, its signal flickered on the cruiser's screens, a faint green holding steady. Then, without flare or fire, The dot simply vanished. No explosion. No warning. Only absence. As though the shuttle had flown into nothing. The Veritas Lux lingered one more night, then turned its prow away, carrying wordless fear back into the void. On the surface, the breaking point came without fanfare. Deep in the sublevels of Manufactorum 9, where pipes wept condensation and steel walls echoed with distant drips, a scream rang out. Workers rushed toward the sound, their footfalls thundering on metal grates. What they found was not a saboteur, not a corpse, not even blood. It was emptiness. A man who had stood among them only moments before was gone. His tools scattered across the floor, the steam still rising from a cup of nutrient broth he had dropped mid-sip. Only his shadow remained, burnt faintly into the wall behind him, as though a flash of impossible light had erased his body but preserved the memory of his outline. When word spread, the silence grew unbearable. No one spoke openly of it, but every face wore the truth. This was no longer simple failure. The forges had not merely stilled. Something had claimed them. Something unseen, unvoiced, yet certain, was at work. And as night fell again upon the husks of a silent forge world, the people of Drelgast understood a terrible truth. Silence had teeth. The cult Mechanicus had always preached that man was nothing without the machine. To be born flesh alone was to be flawed. To be grafted with steel was to rise closer to the Omnissiah's perfection. On Drelgast, this truth was not an article of faith but the rhythm of existence. Every life, from the smallest laborer to the loftiest muggos, was intertwined with machine spirits. The forges fed them, the cogitators guided them, the reactors gave them light, the servitors gave them purpose. Now, with those voices silenced, every soul on the planet felt the wound. A tech priest named Vadran stood before a dead reactor core, his mechadendrites curling and uncurling like nervous fingers. For decades, he had chanted the same sequence of litanies each morning to this core, his vocoder whispering binary prayers while his hands traced sigils of activation across the sacred panels. The machine had always responded, sometimes slowly, sometimes with a sullen groan, but always faithfully, like a loyal beast stirred to life. Now, his chants echoed back at him unanswered. His sensors detected nothing. The great pistons of the core remained inert. Vadran's augmented eyes flickered red as he repeated the ritual a second. Then a third time, each intonation louder, more desperate. Still nothing. His fellow priests murmured their own prayers, but the silence swallowed them whole. Vadran's mind, once a disciplined lattice of logic, began to fray. He wondered, against all tenets of the Creed Mechanicus, whether the machine spirits themselves had fled. Elsewhere, in the habstacks, laborers sat at the feet of idle servitors, stroking their cold augmetics like children stroking dead pets. These men and women had been raised to obey the steady cadence of factory lines, their entire lives reduced to the rhythm of work and the promise of rations. With the machines stalled, their purpose evaporated. Without command, the servitors merely stared blankly into the gloom, their eyes pale and unblinking. A child tugged at the robes of one, asking why it no longer sang. The servitor's voxbox crackled only with static, and the child began to cry. For the Scutarii, silence struck differently. They were soldiers bred for obedience, their minds wired into command frequencies, their augmetics calibrated to respond to signals from their masters. Without vox coordination, their patterns fractured. Patrols wandered aimlessly, their footfalls echoing down empty streets, their galvanic rifles cradled without purpose. A sergeant attempted to rally his squad through direct command, but his words carried no weight, for the command links that bound their minds together had failed. One by one, his troops simply stopped listening, their augmetics twitching as though awaiting instructions that never came. The sergeant, stripped of the certainty that had defined him, knelt in the dirt of a silent avenue and removed his helmet. His flesh eyes, long ignored in favor of augmetics, blinked uselessly into the dim light, as if seeing for the first time just how blind he had always been. The wound spread deeper with each passing cycle. In the grand data vaults, Adepts accustomed to living in harmony with cogitators found themselves staring at dark screens, their hands shaking as they tried to scribe records into empty air. Their pens carved meaningless symbols across parchment, desperate to simulate the endless flow of numbers and ledgers that once defined their worth. When confronted by superiors, they offered sheaves of blank paper, insisting the data was there if only one looked closely enough. The Muggos ordered several executed for madness, but even as their bodies were dragged away, the others kept scratching their quills against void, unable to stop, as though silence itself had become a program etched into their minds. It was not just a collapse of function. It was a collapse of identity. On Drelgast, the machine had always been more than tool. It had been God, parent, and reason. To lose it was to lose meaning itself. The silence hollowed them from within, leaving them not merely powerless, but directionless. Flesh without the hum of steel was weakness, and weakness was death. Yet there were some who began to see in the silence a kind of revelation. A junior engineer named Halrix, stripped of command links and unmoored from ritual, whispered to his peers that perhaps the flesh was meant to endure alone, that the silence was a test, and that only those who remembered their humanity would survive it. He was dragged into the sanctum of the Muggos and publicly denounced, his tongue replaced with a cog of iron. But his words lingered, carried like sparks in the dark. Perhaps the wound of silence was not death. Perhaps it was change. The red basilica loomed above the habstacks like a shrine of iron teeth, its towers bristling with vox arrays that no longer sang. Within its halls, the priesthood of Drelgast gathered beneath banners of the cog mechanicus, their augmetic limbs clattering restlessly as they argued. Once, their debates had been coded in precise binary bursts, efficient and cold, but now the sound was ragged and shrill, flesh voices breaking through as logic failed to hold. Muggos Trevain, his torso little more than a mass of tubing and iron ribs, slammed a mechadendrite into the floor and demanded silence, but silence was no longer his to command. Paranoia festered. Some priests accused their peers of corruption, whispering that the machine spirits had withdrawn because of impurity in the sacred rites. Others claimed heresy, pointing trembling fingers at colleagues whose implants were more flesh than steel. The arguments spiraled until mechadendrites lashed against one another in sudden violence, sparks spitting across the basilica floor as robes burned and cables snapped. A tech priest was torn apart before the altar, his augmetics ripped free like offerings, while others chanted binary litanies to drown out the screams. What had once been unity now fractured into sects, each clutching its own desperate explanation for the silence. The Scitarii, deprived of the command streams that once guided them, began to splinter as well. In the absence of orders, cohorts adopted their own interpretations of duty. Some continued their patrols endlessly, marching in perfect squares through empty manufactoria, their footfalls drumming like metronomes in the void. Others sealed themselves into bunkers, building barricades as if preparing for an invasion that never came. A few, unmoored from purpose entirely, stripped their augmetics from their flesh in madness, leaving themselves bleeding husks that died within hours. Their commanders, helpless without the cohesion of the noospheric link, could only watch as discipline eroded into chaos. Among the laboring masses, hunger gnawed deeper. The silence of the forges meant ration quotas had ceased. The silos, once overflowing with nutrient paste, grew empty. Families bartered scraps of metal for food, or hunted the vermin that thrived in the ducts. In one hab level, a crowd dragged down a servitor, smashing its augmetics apart in desperation to scavenge its nutrient tubing. The priests declared the act sacrilege, but the mob did not care. Hunger had stripped away faith. The Omnissiah could not fill their stomachs, and so they turned on his servants. Rumors spread that the priests were hoarding food and water in the upper sanctums. Whether true or not, the belief fanned rebellion. Workers scrawled crude symbols on rusted walls, mocking the cog mechanicus with broken circles, as if the sacred gear had lost its teeth. When Scitarii patrols attempted to disperse the gatherings, they were met not with prayers but with stones and torches. One squad was dragged into a furnace pit, their bodies immolated in the same fires that once purified steel. The forges were cold, but the mob made them burn again, if only for vengeance. Mugos Trevain responded with executions. Hundreds were dragged into the Basilica Square, their screams echoing off iron walls as they were flayed and wired into silence. Yet the executions brought no order. The silence of the machines remained, and each death only widened the gulf between priesthood and populace. For the first time in living memory, the people of Drelgast began to imagine life without their tech priest masters. Amid this collapse, whispers of strange occurrences multiplied. A data slate powered itself without connection, glowing faint green with runes that no one could read. A Scutarii cohort vanished inside a manufactorum, their galvanic rifles left stacked in perfect rows beside the entrance, as though set down by invisible hands. A worker swore he saw a furnace flicker to life on its own, flames burning without fuel, whispering in a voice that sounded almost human. The priests dismissed these reports as madness, but even they began to record anomalies in secret. Something was stirring within the machine, but it was not the Omnissiah. The silence had ceased to be absence. It was now a language, spoken in flickers of light and strange harmonics, understood only in fear. And though the people of Drelgast clung to their fractured faith, none could deny the truth pressing closer with each passing hour. The wound of the machine was not healing. It was spreading, deeper and darker, as though the world itself had begun to bleed. The nights on Drelgast grew longer, though the orbital charts insisted the planet's rotation had not shifted. Darkness seemed to pool in the alleys and manufactoria, thick and heavy, clinging to the steel walls as if the light of the lumen globes could no longer push it back. Whole sectors went black when their power grids collapsed, and the priests, once able to reroute energy with the ease of thought, now found their data streams corrupted. In those lightless hours, strange hymns were heard in the distance, metallic voices chanting in cadences not known to any imperial creed. The Vox recordings captured nothing, but every witness swore they had heard it. The song of machines without masters. Mugos Trevain convened his council in the Basilica once more, but the voices of the priests were no longer debating theory. They were confessing nightmares. One had dreamt of the cog mechanicus turning against itself, its teeth grinding into dust. Another had woken to find his implants refusing his will, his augmetics twitching as if guided by another hand. A third claimed to have glimpsed a vast shadow passing over the data streams, an intelligence immense and wordless, like a predator brushing against the edges of its cage. These were not the orderly confessions of men of logic. They were the ramblings of the broken, whispered through cracked vox grills in fear that even speaking them aloud would give them weight. Outside the basilica, the population began to shape the silence into its own mythology. Some said the machine spirits had abandoned the priests in disgust, taking refuge among the common folk. Pilgrims gathered around broken generators and bowed before them, whispering prayers into their cooling vents, hoping to coax a flicker of life from their dead hearts. Others believed the silence itself was holy, a purification of sound, and they walked the streets with their lips sewn shut, bleeding in devotion to the stillness. The priests who tried to denounce them as heretics found themselves outnumbered by mobs who claimed the Omnissiah was speaking through absence, not presence. Yet darker cults emerged too, born from hunger and despair. Symbols appeared on walls, crude parodies of the imperial Aquila, its wings torn away, replaced with jagged circles of iron. In the underhabs, whispers told of gatherings where blood was offered to the silence, poured into engine housings that seemed to drink it eagerly. A Scutarii patrol sent to break one such gathering vanished, and when reinforcements arrived, they found only their armor, neatly stacked in a ring, as though left in tribute. The collapse spread inward. Machines that had been dormant began to twitch with unnatural life, powered by no fuel, no reactor. Conveyor belts ran with nothing upon them, gears grinding without teeth, pressing emptiness into shapes unseen. A colossal blast furnace roared awake, though no workers had lit its flame. From its chimney, the smoke rose in perfect spirals that did not disperse, hanging over the city like a black halo. Some called it a blessing, others a curse, but all stared in awe, for none could deny that the world was moving without their touch. Mugos Trevane stood before the basilica's sacred cogitator core, its vast memory banks stretching into shadow. He laid his mechadendrites upon its casing and tried to commune as he had done countless times before, reciting the litanies of awakening, burning incense in the vents, whispering the binary hymns. For hours he pleaded. But the core did not respond with the familiar hum of acknowledgement. Instead, he heard a sound that froze his remaining human flesh. A slow, deliberate knocking from deep within the machine, as if something were trapped inside, waiting. The realization spread among the priests like a contagion. This silence was not failure. It was intention. The forges had not died. They had chosen to still themselves. And if they had chosen, then what hand guided that choice? The priests found no courage in their answers. On the streets of Drelgast, despair began to taste like revelation. The people no longer asked when the machines would awaken. They asked what they would awaken as. And in every silence, in every breathless pause of the forges, they thought they heard it. A listening, patient, and cruel. The forge world had survived 1,000 sieges, 1,000 plagues, and the unending toll of millennia under the Imperium's yoke. But never had it faced an enemy as insidious as silence. At first it was paranoia, the priests accusing each other of error, the laborers whispering of spirits fled. Yet in time, the silence began to shape itself into form, and that form was unmistakably predatory. It began with the patrols. Scutarii cohorts sent into the ash-choked outer manufactoria to investigate the darkened engines failed to return. At first their absence was excused as signal corruption, vox distortion caused by lingering storms of magnetic discharge. But then came the images, captured in fractured bursts of data before the links collapsed. A glimpse of movement across the blasted courtyards. Something vast and skeletal, metal reflecting the furnace glow though no furnace burned. Another clip showed Scutarii opening fire into shadow, their galvanic rifles flaring, before their lenses whited out in static. When the transmission cleared, the corridor stood empty. The soldiers were gone. Only the echo of their gunfire remained, looping faintly until the recording died. Rumors spread with the speed of plague. Some swore Tyranids had descended, stripping the world clean as they had done to 1,000 others, their feeder tendrils piercing even steel. Others claimed orcs had burrowed into the manufactoria, silent for once, preparing the forges for their grotesque parody of war-making. But there were whispers older still, spoken only in the deepest vaults, of green lights that flickered in the dark where no power ran, and of metallic figures that moved without sound, their eyes burning like emerald furnaces. Such words were hushed, for to name the Necrons was to admit the galaxy's most ancient nightmare had come to walk once more. The ordinary folk did not need proof. They needed only the evidence of absence. Markets that once rang with haggling voices now lay empty, their stalls toppled, goods untouched. Hab blocks stood silent, their doors locked from within, their inhabitants vanished without sign of struggle. In one district, entire families were found sitting at their tables, uneaten rations before them, their bodies perfectly preserved yet lifeless, as if the spark of existence had been siphoned away. Priests tried to cloak these discoveries in ritual words, calling it the Omnissiah's judgment, but none believed them. The stillness of the corpses was too much like the stillness of the machines. Fear turned inward, suspicion gnawing at the bonds that held the population together. Scutarii patrols began firing on civilians who approached them too closely, convinced they were infiltrators. Tech priests accused each other of treachery, declaring machine spirits had been poisoned by rival sections. And in the void above, the defense fleet drifted in uneasy formation, cut off from their supply lines, their sensors registering phantom contacts that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Mugos Trevane, gaunt with exhaustion, made one final attempt to broadcast a plea for aid. Standing in the vox chamber of the basilica, surrounded by the incense-thick haze of his fellow priests, he ordered the long-range transmitter to ignite its plasma coils. For a moment, the machine roared to life, filling the chamber with the thrum of power long absent. But when the signal surged into the void, it did not carry words. Instead, A sound bled through the channels, a droning metallic chorus that seemed to vibrate within the bones of all who heard it. Not binary, not hymn, not even language, just a resonance, deep and endless, that made the walls shiver. The priests collapsed to their knees, clutching their skulls as if the sound had crawled into their augmetics. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The silence returned. The transmitter was dead, its coils fused, its machine spirit utterly gone. That was the moment when hope died. The Forge world had not merely lost contact with the Imperium. It had been claimed, its voice stolen, replaced with another. And though no enemy yet marched openly through its streets, the people of Drelgast knew they were no longer alone. Something vast and unseen had entered their world, and it was patient enough to let silence do the killing for it. The first open sign came in the outer manufactoria, where the night shift workers clung to the failing generators and whispered their hymns to broken pistons. When dawn should have come, it did not. The sky remained locked in a dull iron gloom, and then, without warning, the ash fields outside the city flared green. It was not fire, nor lightning, but a pale emerald radiance, as if something beneath the earth had awakened and was breathing through the cracks. Workers fled in droves, their screams echoing down corridors as the ground trembled with the rhythm of unseen engines, older than the Imperium itself. Skirmishes followed. Skitarii units dispatched into the glow did not return, and soon the basilica itself was shaken by reports of phalanxes of metal figures, their forms sleek and skeletal, striding in absolute silence. No vox chatter accompanied them, no war cry, no sound of footfalls. Only the cold gleam of their eyes and the hiss of Gauss weaponry that stripped flesh, steel, and stone into nothingness. To look upon them was to know futility. Bullets sparked against their frames, plasma bolts only slowed them, and even when blasted apart, their broken bodies crawled back together, reassembling as if the laws of mortality did not apply. The people called them the dead that walk. The priests refused to name them, for the word necron had no place in their liturgies, no prayer strong enough to banish its shadow. Yet the reality was undeniable. Drelgast had not fallen to plague, nor rebellion, nor the crude invasions of lesser foes. It had drawn the attention of something that had slumbered beneath its crust since before the Emperor walked Terra, and now those ancient tombs were stirring with hunger. The common folk fled deeper into the hives, but there was nowhere left to run. Gauss fire carved through the walls, reducing ferrocrete to drifting ash. Whole habblocks collapsed into dust without sound, their inhabitants vanishing as if erased from existence. Vox lines filled with static and screams, cut short by the hollow silence that always followed. More terrifying still were the disappearances with no battle, no destruction. Districts simply going dark, their population gone without trace, leaving streets and chambers perfectly ordered, as if life itself had been deleted. Mugos Trevain, surrounded by his dwindling council, demanded answers from the machine spirits, though in his heart he knew none would come. He had once believed silence to be absence, but now he saw it for what it was, dominance. The invaders had no need to speak, for their presence was enough. The stillness was their weapon, their declaration, their promise. Every forge extinguished, every generator quieted, every voice hushed was not failure, but conquest. And yet, even in the face of annihilation, the human soul fought to resist. Skitarii fired until their galvanic rifles overheated, tearing into waves of skeletal warriors that advanced without pause. Servitors were reprogrammed to hurl themselves into furnace cores, detonating in desperate blasts to buy moments of reprieve. And the common laborers, stripped of augmetics, armed only with hammers and cutting tools, rose to defend their forges with prayers on their lips, even as their blood turned to vapor under Gauss fire. Their courage was not victory, but it was defiance, and for a brief heartbeat, it slowed the inevitable. Yet, in the basilica's deepest vaults, Trevain understood what the people did not. Drelgast's silence had not been a warning of invasion. It had been the first step of assimilation. The forges had not been broken. They had been claimed, their spirits bent, their engines stilled not in death but in reverence to the ancient tombs stirring below. Every unanswered prayer, every failed ignition, every machine that moved of its own accord. These were not malfunctions. They were conversions. The Forge world had already begun its transformation, and no plea to Terra, no sacrifice of blood, could turn it back. The emerald glow that had first flickered on the horizon spread like a contagion, seeping through the steel bones of Drelgast. Entire manufactoria began to resonate with a frequency too deep for human ears. Yet every implant, every augmetic cog, every bionic limb shivered in response. Servitors collapsed mid-task, their flesh smoking as their cranial implants overloaded, their voices hissing fragments of binary static that no priest could decipher. For the Scitarii, whose bodies were more metal than man, the effect was worse. Some turned their rifles on their own kin without warning, their lenses flaring green before they fell silent forever. Others froze in place, locked in mechanical rigor, their augmetics hijacked by alien logic. To the priests, it was confirmation of what they had whispered in terror. The invaders were not merely conquering flesh, but reaching into the circuitry of the forge itself. On the surface, the Necrons marched with the precision of inevitability. They did not roar like orcs, nor swarm with hunger like Tyranids. They advanced in lines of steel and silence, their Gauss weapons leaving only ruin in their wake. Factories that had once produced weapons for the Imperium now stood as mausoleums, their walls stripped to skeletal frames, their machines dismantled as though consumed by invisible teeth. In one district, witnesses reported seeing entire columns of laborers simply vanish, erased by sweeping beams of light that left nothing behind but shadows etched into the walls. Resistance grew desperate. The Basilica's Vox networks carried fragmented reports of Scitarii legions locking themselves into siege lines, chanting binary war hymns as they were scoured from existence. Tech priests detonated plasma reactors to collapse manufactoria onto advancing phalanxes, reducing ancient engines of industry to molten slag in futile sacrifice. Even the common workers took up arms, wielding hammers and plasma torches, swarming the invaders with the last remnants of human fury. For a moment, in that chaos, the people of Drelgast tasted the pride of defiance, of standing against something greater than themselves. But every act of defiance only fed the inevitability of silence. Above, the defense fleet made its stand. Monitors and escort frigates pivoted in tight formation, their macro-cannons unleashing firestorms into the void. For a brief hour, victory seemed possible as greenlit shapes were torn apart in the black. But then the stars themselves shifted. Vast silhouettes emerged from the darkness, monolithic vessels of black metal, their surfaces alive with shifting glyphs. Weapons fired into their hulls vanished as though swallowed, energy beams bent and absorbed by impossible geometry. And when the ships answered, their response was surgical, entire frigates carved apart in a single sweep, left drifting as silent husks. Survivors whispered that the Necrons did not fire to kill. They fired to erase. Back on the surface, the Basilica shook as the enemy drew near. Muggos Trevain gathered his council one final time, their robes tattered, their augmetics sparking. Some wanted to fight until their last breath, others demanded retreat into the catacombs. Trevain alone stood silent, staring into the vast cogitator core at the Basilica's heart. For days it had offered only absence, only that steady, patient knocking deep within. Now at last it opened, not with words, but with presence. His mind filled with shapes and equations not meant for human thought, with the cold geometry of eternity. He felt his prayers unravel, his faith fracture, as something vast brushed against the edges of his soul. The machine god had not abandoned Drelgast. It had been replaced. And then the walls split open. The first of the Necron lords entered, towering, its form draped in living metal that shifted like liquid. Its staff hummed with energies older than stars, and its eyes burned with the patience of an empire that had never truly died. Around it, lesser warriors moved with mechanical grace, their weapons raised not in haste but in ceremony. For them, this was not conquest. It was reclamation. The silence that had haunted Drelgast was no longer absence. It was a throne room, a stage prepared for the return of kings who had waited in their tombs for eons uncounted. And now they had risen, The Necron phalanxes marched with inevitability, but their presence alone could not explain all that had unfolded. Whole manufactoria had fallen silent before the first emerald glow split the skies. The machine spirits had ceased their hymns long before the skeletal warriors emerged from their tombs. And among the priests of Drelgast, a darker suspicion began to whisper that silence had been invited, that somewhere in the endless sprawl of steel and faith, voices had chosen mutiny, had sung hymns not to the Omnissiah, but to something older. The cult Mechanicus had never been united. Beneath the surface of obedience lay endless schisms, quiet rivalries between sects, and interpretations of the machine god that clashed like grinding gears. To most, these were doctrinal disputes, more ritual than rebellion. But in the silence, those fractures widened into chasms. Priests accused one another of heresy, of withholding knowledge, of deliberately stilling the engines to prove some obscure theological point. And in the chaos of invasion, those accusations began to find flesh. In the underhives, symbols appeared daubed in oil and blood. Circles of jagged steel intersected by lines of green, crude imitations of the Necron glyphs seen in the distance. Entire worker congregations were found gathered before cold reactors, chanting prayers not of ignition but of cessation, their voices uniting in praise of the stillness that consumed them. These cults spoke of liberation from the tyranny of labor, of breaking the chains that bound flesh to machine. To the priests it was madness, for without the machine the Imperium was nothing. But to the desperate, to the starving, to those who had watched their families vanish into silence, it was a gospel that promised peace. Worse still, fragments of evidence began to suggest that not all priests opposed it. A data slate, recovered from the corpse of a fallen tech adept, contained binary canticles praising the celestial stillness, declaring that the Omnissiah was not the emperor upon his golden throne, but the eternal silence embodied in the skeletal forms now walking the planet. Entire passages of scripture had been rewritten in twisting ciphers, turning prayers of ignition into hymns of extinction. Trevane himself, poring over the fragments, felt the weight of blasphemy crush his heart. For these words were not the desperate ramblings of the uninitiated. They bore the structure of formal doctrine, the signature of high-ranking minds. The idea gnawed at him, more terrifying than the Necrons themselves. If silence had taken root before the first Gauss flare, if the forges had been stilled from within, then perhaps Drelgast's fall had not begun with invasion at all. Perhaps the invaders had simply answered a call. Yet there was no time to purge, no tribunal to judge the guilty. Heresy now walked openly among the loyal, indistinguishable in robe and implant. Processions of priests vanished into the lower levels, chanting binary litanies Trevane could not translate, their voices merging into a single harmonic thrum that reverberated through the metal bones of the city. Those who pursued them did not return, and from the depths below, where the Necron tombs pushed upward with patient inevitability, came a sound too deliberate to be chance, the sound of human voices singing in unison with the machines of the dead. The invasion had become more than conquest. It had become communion. The invasion pressed ever deeper, but within the heart of Drelgast, it was not Gauss fire alone that broke resistance. It was belief. In the darkened manufactoria, men and women who had once knelt faithfully before the Imperial Aquila now knelt instead before cold engines, their hands slick with oil as they painted alien sigils across ferrocrete walls. They spoke in binary tongues their neighbors could not understand, their voices clicking in arrhythmic patterns that imitated the pulse of Necron glyphs. When Skitarii patrols descended to scatter them, they found not mobs but congregations, thousands of workers standing in perfect silence, their eyes glassy, their lips parted as though awaiting command. When ordered to disperse, the masses did not resist. They simply stared, unblinking, until the Skitarii withdrew, unsettled by an enemy that neither fought nor fled. Rumors reached the basilica that entire sects of the Mechanicus had turned, not through cowardice, nor simple despair, but through conviction. They declared that the silence consuming Drelgast was not death but ascension. The forges had been enslaved to the Imperium for millennia, their machine spirits chained to endless toil. Now, they claimed, the silence was liberation, the Omnissiah unshackled from Terra's lies, manifesting not in the golden light of the Emperor but in the cold order of the ancient dead. Where loyalists prayed for the Emperor's guiding hand, these cultists prayed for the stillness to spread across the galaxy, ending the ceaseless wars of men in one final pause. Even the Scutarii began to falter. Units once unshakable in loyalty found their ranks thinning, as individuals broke away mid-patrol and vanished into the night. Some returned days later, their augmetics engraved with crude glyphs that glowed faintly green. Their voices altered into flat, monotone binary. They no longer spoke of duty, but of inevitability, and when ordered to fire upon the enemy, they hesitated, lowering their rifles as if unwilling to raise them against gods. Muggos Trevain, gaunt and sleepless, raged at his counsel. He demanded exorcisms of heresy, demanded purges, demanded fire and blade. But his voice trembled, for he knew the infection was deeper than any purge could cut. His adepts reported that even in the basilica itself, prayers to the Omnissiah were faltering. Some of his own priests muttered new canticles under their breath, hymns of cessation dressed in the rhythms of loyal litanies. One was caught etching glyphs into the cogitator housings, his mechadendrites twitching as though guided by another hand. When questioned, he did not scream nor beg, but simply whispered, "We have only returned to the first machine." The line between worship and treason dissolved. Who could say which prayer was true when the machines themselves obeyed the silence? Which hymn carried authority when the forges burned green, when Gauss fire carved the sky, when the Emperor's light reached no further than static? Faith, once the Imperium's strongest chain, had become its sharpest fracture. In the lower levels of Drelgast, where the tombs stirred in restless slumber, the cults gathered in vast processions. There, among the awakening pylons of black metal, human throats gave voice to alien song. Witnesses spoke of hymns that bent the very air, harmonies so deep that steel walls trembled and cogitators rebooted into new, unreadable languages. To listen too long was to feel one's own pulse slow, as if one's heart wished to beat in rhythm with eternity. The Necrons had no need to spread doctrine. Humanity was doing it for them. The Basilica, once the heart of Drelgast's worship, no longer sounded with the steady chant of litanies. Its echoing halls were fractured with dissonance. Half-prayers spoken in binary that faltered midway, hymns that shifted into alien rhythms, incantations that ended not in the Emperor's name but in silence. Muggos Trevain could hear it even when his adepts thought him absent. The pauses too long, the cadences too exact, as though some hidden choir was teaching new hymns beneath the floor. Suspicion gnawed at him until he could no longer ignore it. He called his inner circle together, demanding an oath of loyalty before the sacred cogitator core. The priests gathered, their augmetics gleaming in the dim glow of failing lumen strips. Their voices rose in the familiar catechisms, but as they did, Trevain noticed subtle shifts. The pauses between verses were not hesitation. They were rests, measured silences arranged with precision. He felt the cold of it seep into him. These were not mistakes. These were deliberate notes in a new liturgy, one that praised not the machine god but the stillness that had claimed the world. His rage boiled over. With a voice amplified through his vox grill, he demanded confession, demanded names. Who among them had turned? Who had stilled the forges? But the priests did not tremble or protest. One by one, they turned their lenses upon him, unblinking, their mechadendrites curling like iron serpents. And then, with a unity more terrible than any hymn, they fell silent. The quiet was suffocating. Trevain felt his heart stutter, his augmetics humming in discord as though caught in some unseen field. He slammed his staff upon the floor, trying to drown it out with the thrum of sacred wards, but the silence only deepened. Then, from the vox ports of the cogitator core, came a sound, not binary, not language, but a resonant hum that carried in his bones. His priests bowed as one, their voices rising in a single phrase, "The first machine awakens." Trevain staggered back, horror coursing through his flesh. These were not mere cultists in the underhive. These were his own council, the highest keepers of lore, the priests who had once overseen the great reactors of Drelgast. And they were no longer his. In that instant he understood. The heresy was not a fringe infection but a wound at the heart of the forge. The silence had been welcomed, nurtured, sung into being by those who should have been its fiercest defenders. Drelgast had not simply been conquered. It had been betrayed from within. Outside the basilica, the invasion pressed on, Necron phalanxes marching through the ruins. Inside, Trevain faced a truth that made Gauss' fire seem merciful. His world had chosen silence. The fall of a forge world is not simply the extinguishing of a city, nor even the death of billions. It is a fracture in the Imperium's chain of firelight, a rent in the great machine of survival that stretches from Terra to the fringe. When Drelgast fell silent, the shock rippled outward, carried on broken astropathic whispers, half-screams that dissolved into static before reaching their destinations. For weeks afterward, the Imperium did not even know whether the planet yet lived, or whether it had been unmade in an instant. The silence was worse than certainty. It was a wound without a voice. Those who escaped Drelgast carried with them stories that no report could catalog. They spoke of hymns without words, of priests whose mechadendrites moved in time with alien resonance, of vast forges that continued to thunder with motion even though their engines were cold. They spoke of Necrons walking not as invaders but as processions, as though the city itself had been a tomb awaiting their return. Each account was fragmented, contradictory, unstable. Some described endless legions. Others swore that only a handful of silver figures strode the streets. Yet wherever they passed, entire sectors fell still and lifeless. The administratum attempted to reconcile these testimonies, but their quills faltered. Numbers did not match, charts refused to balance. Vox recordings degraded into corrupted hums. Among the faithful, word of Drelgast's fate transformed into liturgy. Some claimed it was punishment for hidden pride, for forgetting that the Omnissiah was one with the Emperor and not some machine apart. Others whispered that Drelgast had been chosen, its silence a sign of something greater stirring in the depths of time. In the underchapels of distant shrine worlds, penitents struck their brows against stone, chanting fragments of Drelgast's broken hymns, trying to divine a meaning in the pauses and absences. The silence itself became scripture, a scripture written in void. And always, rumors circled back to the phrase the cult had uttered before the end. The first machine awakens. Some said it referred to the Necrons, the first lords of the stars. Others whispered it was a blasphemy, a rival machine god rising to claim worshippers from Mars itself. And still others, daring even to murmur it, wondered if the silence was the Emperor's own design. A new form of order, colder and purer than fire, that would sweep away the noise of rebellion and weakness. None could prove anything. None could deny the possibility. What is remembered is not the thunder of battle, nor the names of generals who perished on the manufactoria lines. What is remembered is the silence, that unbroken, inexorable silence that spread outward until it seemed the very stars dimmed. The silence became the echo of Drelgast, carried by rumor, fear, and prayer. The forge world was gone, but its absence endured, heavier than stone, sharper than flame. There are those who argue that worlds do not truly die, that every planet struck down by war leaves behind a resonance, a scar that persists in the warp like a bruise upon reality. If that is true, then Drelgast's scar is unlike any other, for it was not marked by fire or rage but by absence. Astropaths who strain to catch its faintest echoes report not the familiar shriek of tortured souls, nor the maddening screams of demons feeding upon carnage, but a hollowing quiet that erodes their sanity more surely than any noise. One confessed, before his tongue split and blackened, that he heard the hum of endless gears slowing to stillness, as though the very machinery of existence was grinding down into nothing. Within the halls of the Mechanicus, Drelgast became a forbidden word. Some magi insisted it was heresy to even speak the planet's name, while others attempted to encode the silence into logic rites, seeking a pattern within the void. Yet the data never aligned, for every analysis ended in corruption, every cogitator sequence collapsing into static hums. And so a schism whispered itself through hidden chambers. Was the machine god defeated upon Drelgast, or had he revealed a new face, one not of fire and forge but of cessation? Those who embraced the latter dared to pray in unspoken cadences, offering silence itself as worship. The Imperium, ever pragmatic in its cruelty, recorded Drelgast as lost. A line of ink across a parchment, a designation of exterminatus without the fire ever falling. But soldiers who had once served there refused to accept so clean an ending. They spoke in their sleep of walking the empty streets, of hearing hymns resonating through steel though no priest's lips moved, of machines turning without power. Some begged to be redeployed, convinced that their world was not dead but waiting. Others fell into despair, raving that if silence could consume a forge, then none of the Emperor's lights were safe. And yet, even amidst the loss, there were those who found hope in the omen. For if silence could sweep across a world and end all division, all rebellion, all suffering in an instant, was that not a kind of peace? A terrible peace, yes, but peace nonetheless. Pilgrims carried this dangerous thought across the stars, singing hymns that ended mid-verse, bowing before altars where no words were spoken. The Inquisition stamped out such practices wherever they were uncovered, but like embers carried on the wind, they always reignited elsewhere. Thus Drelgast's memory endures, not as a tale of fire and conquest, but as an echo of obliteration. A silence that seeps into prayers and nightmares alike. A silence that makes every Forge World priest wonder, if only for a moment, whether the great song of the machine is truly eternal, or whether all things must one day fade into stillness. The ruin of Drelgast has long since been sealed in the Administratum's archives, reduced to a catalog number and a sigil of loss. Yet no seal, no ink, no quill can prevent the memory from moving in the hearts of those who heard its silence. In distant void ships, crewmen speak of hearing a low hum in the metal of their berths, as though the vessel itself remembers the song of stillness. Pilgrims light votive candles in the dark and let them gutter out without word or hymn, believing that in the flame's final flicker, they glimpse the shadow of Drelgast's end. Even among the ordos of the Inquisition, where tongues are trained to scorn myth, there is unease. Too many reports contradict. Too many survivors repeat the same phrase without ever having met. Too many voices murmur, "The first machine awakens." No truth has ever been carved from the silence. The Necrons that walked Drelgast left behind no monuments, no banners, no declarations of conquest. They did not desecrate the Imperial Aquila, nor claim the manufactoria as their own. They simply left stillness, as though the planet had never been meant for fire and industry at all, but had always been a tomb, merely biding its time until the song of the forge fell quiet enough for their return. And in that thought lies the greatest horror, for if Drelgast was always theirs, how many other worlds might yet prove the same? And so the Imperium watches its own forges with suspicion. Each lapse in production, each unplanned pause in chant, each moment when a reactor hums one beat slower than expected, all of it becomes an omen. Tech priests scour the runes of power with fevered eyes, fearing to glimpse the same pattern that condemned Drelgast. When silence falls in a manufactorum, even for an instant, every worker holds their breath, waiting to hear whether the sound will return. Thus the Forge World that once roared with unending fire is remembered not for its brilliance, nor its industry, nor even its downfall in flame. It is remembered as the world that fell to absence, the world that whispered of betrayal within and inevitability without, the world whose silence was louder than war. And if the echo of that silence lingers still, traveling in the warp, etched into the bones of ships, carried in the dreams of astropaths and priests, then perhaps Drelgast has not truly ended. Perhaps its stillness spreads, slow and patient, waiting to claim the stars themselves. For in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even silence is a weapon, and Drelgast has already shown how easily it can win.